So how is the Nordic curl machine going to help me snatch more, run faster, squat better, and jump higher? Well, there's a couple of different areas we need to look at on things we can do on this machine. Now, before we get going, this isn't a sponsored video. I literally just bought the cheapest Nordic curl machine that I could find, very specifically about what I'm doing in my own training to improve these qualities in the most efficient way possible in my home gym. And it hopefully should give you some areas to think about in your own training, because there's a good chance if you're watching this, you probably want to improve one of those areas. So if we take the first area, one of the main reasons I got this Nordic curl machine is to work up to full Nordic curls and potentially weighted Nordic curls. Prime reason we're doing this is hamstring development. You get a little bit of glute development as well, I suppose, in isometric condition, trying to maintain that hip extension. But the hamstrings take a huge amount of loading here. Why do we want to do a Nordic curl over maybe a stiff-legged deadlift over an RDL? So I'm doing a lot of activities currently that involve a lot of lower back, that involve a lot of arms and upper body. So if we can find an exercise that specifically loads the hamstrings without loading my lower back or having to set up a barbell, then it is quite useful. Now, there's a huge amount of research on the Nordic curl, or specifically Nordic falls, where you're only doing the eccentric portion or some assisted section of the concentric lift, and we see huge benefits to people in hamstring development. It's very interesting to see that really highly loaded eccentric portions of this produce a lot of benefit to the hamstring, even in absence of the concentric portion. So if we look at my goals, snatching, running, jumping, and squatting, why did I need to zone in a little bit more on this? So if we take the snatch, first of all, the at the knee position is one of the most important positions in snatching. If we can hit a good quality position when the barbell is at the knee, then we are going to be in a position where we can allow that barbell to get a good barbell pat. If our knees are too far forward, if we're not loading our hamstrings specifically, if we're not loading them enough, if that knee isn't as far back as it could be, if the hamstrings are unable to tolerate that load, then the barbell is going to be farther forward than where we want it. It's going to pull our center of mass forward, which as a result then is going to push the barbell pat forward. The barbell isn't going to reach back over our center of mass as well. We won't be able to express as much power as we could do. We won't be able to use our legs sufficiently. And then we're going to be in a position where the barbell is going to be knocked away, or we're going to swing the barbell. So if I can be at a position when the barbell is at my knee and I'm very, very strong, and if the hamstrings can tolerate this at the knee position, along with my back of course, then I'm in a position where I can shift the loading back to my hamstrings and then shift it back to my quads when I hit that full extension, and glutes as well, obviously, for the hip extension portion of the lift. So what we're seeing here is that if your hamstrings aren't necessarily up to par, and if you can't maintain a perpendicular shin angle with the floor and a pretty open hamstring angle, it might be that the hamstrings are unable to tolerate the load. Now, of course, it could be a technical issue. In my case, it's not really technical. I know the position I want to hit, but I could improve this further at heavier weights, because those hamstrings, when they get a little bit heavier, the technique is good at lighter weights, but sometimes with those heavier weights, I tend to leave my knees just a little bit too far forward. My quads are obviously pretty well developed. I don't think anyone would argue with that. But if I could enhance the quality of my lower back and my hamstrings to maintain this position, I should be able to maintain that position better. But also, if a muscle group is stronger, if we're more in touch neuromuscularly with that muscle group, we should be able to switch the loading to that muscle group and then switch off it faster. So the faster we can switch between these muscle groups, the faster I can potentially move those weights, and the faster I can move those weights, hopefully the more weight I can lift on the snatch. So the Nordic fall and hopefully a Nordic curl will be a good addition to strengthening this position. If we stick with the hamstring section of the Nordic curl, or the machine I'm using, and we get to sprinting, obviously you've probably done a bit of sprint in your life, you've probably pulled your hamstrings. The hamstrings go through a huge amount of forces when we're running, specifically in that swing phase when we're dragging back through the ground. If we can increase the tolerance of the hamstrings during this phase, if we can increase their capacity to contract during this phase, in theory you should be able to run faster. And that's why we see a lot of international teams and athletics teams, if we see loads of the research done on Nordic curls or Nordic falls done on athletes, because they end up with a huge amount of hamstring issues, and a lot of them find very positive relationship between increasing the eccentric forces the hamstring can tolerate very often on the Nordic fall, and a reduction or prevention or rehab, increasing the rehab process on the hamstring. So if I can improve the quality of my hamstring contractions here, I should be able to sprint faster, or at the very least, when I go maximum balls out on the track and spikes, I won't pull my hamstring again like I did last year, which it was very unpleasant. Then if we move on to the squat, there's probably one area you probably haven't thought a little bit about, or you may haven't thought about before, is that knee control in the squat and the hamstrings are pretty well related. Now the hamstrings aren't massive hip extensors in the squat. They're still involved for sure, But there's a couple of areas in terms of tibial, internal, or external rotation and your pelvic control that the hamstrings play a key part in that we want to be on top of in the squat. The style of squat that I'm doing, when we're looking for a lower back extension, we're obviously putting a bit more of a pressure on the hamstrings because they're going to be more extended. We want to maintain that position at the bottom of the squat because it actually allows us to extend our hips a little bit better as we're standing up, and it allows our upper back to stay in a stronger position so we can have a better quality high bar squat. But also at the bottom of the squat, and to a certain extent on some reps in my snatch, if the hamstrings aren't as low tolerant, if they're not up to scratch as your back or your quads might be, we might actually see a little bit of lack of knee control. And on some reps, certain sides, one or the other side of my knees, will not be as controlled as I descend into the bottom position as I would like them to be. And then on the ascent, on the way up, I don't have as much control as I would like. Now, it's not bad by any means, but it definitely could be improved. And if I can improve the quality of this position while maintaining a better lower back position, I should be able to improve the quality of my squat on the way up. So if you're having knee tracking issues, if you're having knee control, even on some reps of my snatch, if I'm doing a heavy triple or if I've done multiple doubles, normally when I pull off the floor, my knees will remain in a tracked position in the direction of my toes. But on some reps, if I'm a little bit more fatigued, we'll see this immediate move inward of the knees. And if we were to kind of deduce what might be the issues, if we look at my start position, where my hamstrings are, and if we look at the level of hip extension I have and hip height, my quads certainly aren't the issue there. My back is pretty strong. There's probably a good chance that the hamstrings are the weak link here. And if I can improve them, if I can improve this knee tracking position and stop the knees from coming in, I should have a better quality position, better quality reps as the weights get heavier. If we look at vertical jumping and the use of the hamstrings, so again, we've talked about the hamstrings aren't massive parts of that hip extension. So if we're looking at maybe a maximum vertical jump, if we can load the hamstrings, there's a lot of eccentric forces on the hamstrings on the way down. If we can increase the tolerance of these hamstrings and go from a position where they're stretched and then they relax and let the glutes, for example, take over in the hip extension, we're probably going to have a better option for moving from the bottom of that dip in the vertical jump to the full extension to hit maximum height. So if we can go from contraction to relaxation as fast as possible, generally a stronger muscle, if you train it more, you can usually, while also training the speed portion of those muscles, if you can go from that contracted position or that stretched position, well, then we can relax it and then hopefully hit that extended position better and faster in the vertical jump. So I would probably expect to see some improvement in my jumping ability, both in terms of box jumps, but very specifically in that max vertical jump. Now, the last area I also wanted to use this particular machine for was my lower back and abs. So I want to be able to do back extensions a little bit easier. You can do prone back extensions on the floor, which can be pretty productive for sure, but I wanted a bit more range of motion. So what I was hoping to do with this machine was put it on some plates and I would get a fairly sufficient range of motion where I could do some weighted back extensions. Because like I talked about there, at that knee position in the snatch, when we're looking at that position where the lower back is arched and I want that pelvic posterior tilt in that position, I want that arched back and that arched lumbar spine, I want to be able to have a strong lower back and especially that upper back position as well, both in the squat and the snatch. If I can load this up more, if I can get more repetitions, I can also improve the quality of my snatching and my squatting much better. You'll see loads of international teams will alternate back and abs every second day in international weightlifting, and there's good reason for this. Your back is an incredibly important part of weightlifting. The legs are very important also, but the back needs to be trained. Lastly, then, of course, you've probably seen my trials with my core strength in my squat and the need to improve it. And this just gives me a better option to do some extra weighted sit-ups in a scenario that's just a little bit easier to load. We're big fans of weighted sit-ups. We could do other ways of doing this. There's other ways of loading the core and there's a lot of great options. But weighted sit-ups are a very productive way of doing this. And they're a very easy way to progressively load the core work. You know, if you don't have a cable machine, I didn't want to buy a very large DHD machine for my shed. I wanted to keep the equipment as small and as concise as possible. So I figured this would give me an option to anchor my feet while doing sit-ups, and then I could potentially get a bit more weighted core work in. So hopefully this will help me achieve some of my goals. Hopefully you learned a little bit about what might be lacking in some of your training, and the hamstring might be an option there. Again, it's not sponsored. I will try and blur it out if possible if my editing skills are up to scratch. So it is literally the cheapest one I could find, and quality is pretty good to be fair. But hopefully in a couple of weeks I'll be able to do, or maybe a few months, a full Nordic, and we'll see how it impacts it. I'm most excited to see its impact on the snatch and the squat per se. So I know it's going to help jumping and running and sprinting. We've seen that with lots of athletes, but I'm very interested to see how it feels specifically on the snatch and on the squat, because those are the two I'll be pushing pretty hard. And I suspect I'd see a noticeable change in quality of technique on those.